This residency is all about leveraging arts, culture, and public policy to create these interventions around housing and related issues. So really leveraging the radical imagination and vision of artists, how artists inspire and motivate us in ways that, you know, other kinds of information just doesn't necessarily hit the same, right? So working with people like William Estrada, who also work in collaboration. You know, they don't just go into a studio and kind of make things and then present them to the public, but it really is an integrated residency that it works with community, including residents, youth, activists, community organizers, and all kinds of people. This is one example of a project that we did with William Estrada, actually, in addition to doing screen printing workshops. And he also has done portraits and other things like that with the museum. This was a public policy focused project that really helped to push forward this legislation that prohibits landlords from discriminating against tenants with criminal histories. So if you'd like to, learn more about that, look into that. It's called the Just Housing Amendment. It's really, really important legislation. Tanika Lewis Johnson, which was the first artist as instigator that I personally got to work with here at the museum. Her project was called Inequity for Sale, which really looked at the historical practice of land sale contracts, particularly in the community where she grew up in Greater Englewood. And her project was all about calling out these perpetrators, and calling out what she calls legalized theft or a scam in the real estate industry at the time, which really took advantage of Black folks who were redlined.
By 16.
Oh. So she did this memorial project, right, to not only call this out, but also to tell the history and to demand reparations and remediation for these families who were taken advantage of at the time. We also did a podcast, and so that's called Legally Stolen, which is on all podcast platforms. You can check that out. So lots of work happening. There's so much. Yes, she is so dope. Just seeing notes in the chat. But somebody else is really dope. And we're really so honored to be presenting Dr. ShaDawn Battle to you all this evening. I just want to say a couple of words. I know, there's some folks in the room that know her much better than I do. And so, I'm going to just sort of humbly give an introduction. But really, this is your time to connect with her directly. She has a great presentation for you all, and we'll take some questions at the end. But I'll just say a few brief words. Again, Dr. ShaDawn Battle, also known as Boobie, is the museum's 5th artist as instigator. She was selected from a competitive pool of 86 national applicants as a multidisciplinary artist, researcher, activist, and educator whose work spans several mediums. ShaDawn's creative practice is always rooted in transformative justice. Through footwork, filmmaking, and more, you could say ShaDawn's real superpower is creating platforms for truth-telling, centering the most marginalized voices in our communities, which are often Black youth, people in poverty, and others who are creating and preserving culture without investment and support from institutions or government programs. So again, tonight you'll hear a little bit about Dr. Battle's past work and how she plans to leverage the Artist as Instigator residency to develop her new project, Place, Space, and Works. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. ShaDawn Boobie Battle.
All right. Thank you for that. Tiff, are we ready, Mark?
Coming right at you.
Okay. All right. While he's queuing the PowerPoint, I just want to say that I'm so grateful for everybody being here today. If your line of work is anything like mine, I know a happy hour and some vegan egg rolls was much more appealing tonight. But again, I'm ShaDawn Battle. I do have a PhD. My debt to income ratio reminds me, right? But I really don't want to, lead into this work centering like my academic credentials, since it's so incredibly community focused. So, feel free to call me ShaDawn, Boobie, Dr. Boobie, right, which is a perfect merger of the two worlds in which I exist. But I did step away from Chicago Footwork for over a decade to pursue a career as a scholar and as a professor. And I really just didn't see, this inner city dance culture, right? We're not talking about any city. We're talking about a dance culture from Chicago that, that helped to mold me as intersecting with my road to becoming a scholar. Or that was at least until I started working on my forthcoming 5-part docuseries on Chicago. It's titled Footwork Saved My Life, the Evolution of Chicago Footwork, right? And that's when I started really, bridging both worlds. But slide 2, Mark. How did I end up here as the 5th National Public Housing Museum artist as Instigator resident, right? Well, first, like Tiff said, the residency is really unique in that it really does combine art and culture and history and scholarship and policy transformation, right? And, a lot of my work on Chicago Footwork has been like really situated at the intersections of all of these things, right? And so now I don't feel forced to have to choose between scholarship and community and art, right? Because the residency sort of combines all of these things. And second, I really was inspired to apply for the residency because I had been following the work of Tanika Lewis Johnson on land sale contracts and redlining since she was the 3rd National Public Housing Museum resident artist, I believe. Right, so much so that we actually decided to interview her for the film that we're working on Chicago Footwork. Clip. Uh-oh, it went to the next slide, Mark. No audio, Mark.
My project aims to help people understand how homes were stolen from aspiring Black homeowners in the 50s and 60s. We are around living history. You can't make up what happened to this home. It has a direct connection to a racist housing policy. They were sold their home on a land sale contract. They were lied to and told it was a mortgage. And they didn't find out until they missed a payment and were forced to get out. This is the inequity that Black people in neighborhoods in Chicago talk about. John Garner is one of those individuals that paid a down payment, thought he had a mortgage, and had no rights, no equity, nothing. Just imagine if they actually did own their home.
Wow, so they took the home from him, huh?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. They didn't give him a mortgage. He thought he had a mortgage. So
How can you own a home without a mortgage?
through land sale contracts, but you don't really own it. So that's what I'm talking to him about. So yeah, you could, I gotta answer a question, so you could listen, and it'll kind of explain it.
I don't get it. There's got to be something wrong. I mean, I've dealt with houses all my life. I've never heard of nothing like that where people could just walk in and take my house. No.
Well, listen to what I'm about to say, and then it'll kind of make sense. neighborhoods that we hear on the news around gun violence, school closures, and everything else, Greater Inglewood, Garfield Park, Lawndale, those are the exact neighborhoods that had the devastating experience of land sale contracts.
The kids in the footwork culture now are, you know, the byproduct of that historical theft, right? And so the trauma that they've inherited, they don't necessarily understand. I mean, they know like in their face, this is why I'm traumatized, right? Like, you know, Dirk talks about, you know, 8 people in grandma crib. Well, that's because many of those generations of family members were locked out of homeowning opportunities.
Footwork culture, for me, is such a beautiful demonstration of the resilience and the creativity that is still born out of people who experience all of these injustices.
All right, so there's a few things I want to say about that clip, right? Number one, you can tell when I'm doing the videography work versus my but the white guy who walked up on us, right? So I teach this clip in my classes, and it's an example of what one philosopher might call an epistemology of ignorance, right? So epistemology is a study of knowledge production, or how we know what we know. So epistemology of ignorance is pretending that ignorance is reality, is truth, right? And so there's this collective agreement to not see what's right before you, sort of like this gentleman does, right? So we need to ignore this historical record of violence. But what's cool about, you know, the National Public Housing Museum is that it's a cultural institution that puts resources behind, you know, art activists like Tanika, who refuse to sort of allow this collective ignorance to continue to, you know, to fester. The other point that I'll make is that, you know, at the time, I really had just shifted toward, you know, centering my work on housing injustice. And I really can't, you know, take the credit for that pivot, because it was the Chicago footwork community during interviews for the film that basically made it clear to me that there's a direct connection between, you know, Chicago footwork and the history of bogus housing practices, right? But, you know, I've been really intentional about like not going into the film my own agenda, you know, instead making sure I was centering the voices of the flesh and blood people who make up this, you know, Chicago footwork community. And many of them hail from Chicago public housing, were dispersed on account of, you know, systematic demolition of the public housing structures in the city, or had family members who were victimized by land sale contracts, right? And so you'll hear more of their stories, but suffice it to say that, you know, with this particular residency, I just want to continue dialogues on housing theft that, you know, have already been launched by the brilliant work of Tanika and scholars like D. Bradford Hunn and David Stovall and others, right? But I want to use Chicago footwork as a medium to have those conversations, right? One thing that Tanika has said in like some of her past interviews is that the evidence of this theft, she's talking about stealing homes from Black people, she says it's concretely with us, right? Like you could just go no further than Inglewood and look at the boarded up houses, right? As proof. And so I want to work with the youth of Chicago footwork so that they understand that their material realities, their living conditions, the violence they dodge on an everyday basis, their families' lack of generational wealth that could have changed the trajectory of their lives, right? All of this is connected to the theft of place and space and home place, right? And then third, my own family has its, you know, this really interesting relationship to housing and the acquisition of property. My grandfather had a 7th grade education, but, you know, from 1964 to about 1980s, he used the money, the capital that he amassed from the policy game, or running the numbers, right, as folks called it, to purchase at least 12 to 13 residential properties for family members who, you know, didn't have access to homeowning opportunities. They couldn't get loans, right? They were facing evictions. And this was the first home that he purchased for himself, 7731 South May. I'm not sure if it's too far south for it to still be Inglewood, but what he told me is that, you know, he purchased it through a white man named Mr. Ed Truman, and that, you know, he couldn't just go in the bank and get a loan himself, and that, you know, my aunt and my mom told me that there was a German man who lived next door who would frequently call them niggers until he left about, you know, maybe a year later, right? And so even though this, you know, my grandfather represents this Horatio Alger's bootstrap narrative, he wasn't exempt from, at least a semblance of contract deals or racial tensions and white flight, the denial of home loans to Blacks and other practices, right? So this partnership with National Public Housing Museum made sense because the personal is not just political for me, it's historical, right? And I could see history and the museum's oral history archives, right? And so with all that said, I'd like to share the work that I've been doing on Chicago Footwork already. I'm working on this documentary. Again, it's titled Footwork Saved My Life, The Evolution of Chicago Footwork. It's a 5-part docuseries. I argue that, there's 5 different episodes, 5 different generations of Chicago Footwork, and each of the episodes are dedicated to a generation. And I'm looking at how each sort of generation is shaped by one or more of the following socioeconomic and socio-political forces, right? So Chicago's extensive history of racial segregation and educational disparities, the social engineering of gang rivalries, the police force's hyper-surveillance and the criminalization of poor working class Black youth. But again, this particular project, is going to focus on housing and the social engineering of gang violence and, that relationship to Chicago Footwork. So without further ado, here is the sizzle reel for the film project.
Chicago known for its pizza, but when you from the hood, like Chicago is about footwork.
The origins of Chicago Footwork actually go far as back as stepping.
Looking at Black college culture, looking at dance culture, looking at Greek fraternity culture, stepping and all that, you watch how feet operate.
Footwork and djembe. Footwork as being a very African art form.
I saw Chicago Footwork and I was like, what is this? Like, somebody tell me what this is. Oh, that's footworking. You don't know what footwork is?
A freestyle and a battle dance.
It started on the west side of Chicago.
When it came to juke music or ghetto house,
the music was slower.
When they sped the music up, that's when the moves changed.
We call that blind faith. It's either going to be a fad or it's going to be a cultural thing.
It's expression through music, what we was pushing out.
I feel like when we do dance at that moment, we're connecting and having a conversation.
The DJ is good, but the dance is what made it really stand out.
Battling was serious.
Extreme, high energy, like 0 or 100.
The energy is different here. It's aggression.
Every man for himself. You gotta get in that circle.
Meaning you'll have some heavy hitters in the circle, and they'll come in, and you'll have the whole speaker rocking with footwork.
There's no worries. Whatever's going on in life, it ain't in the circle, it ain't there.
I dance from being hurt, so I dance different. Once the beat hit me, I let my feet do what it's supposed to do.
We supposed to be playing basketball. I'm sitting there doing moves till the ball get past him. Hey man, get your dance in there. You feel me? Like,
when I hear the music, I try to become the music. I'm painting a picture for the audience to see.
Even though I wasn't expecting to footwork, now I really can't see my life without it.
That's what helped me build a second family. If I ain't have it, they made sure I did, and I was straight.
It's something about the code of Chicago. Not just cold weather, but cold politics. When you have white flight and you have a disinvestment or divestment of economics, and you still got these homes that's not being valued, you have a lot of activity.
We just lost a footworker to violence.
Whoever knew y'all to be mothers?
True. Ah, man. Whoever knew my kids would still be alive.
Gang mentality, all that stuff. There's qualities in all of it.
All our spaces have been shut down. The culture and the community gaining revenue right under the city nose. And so if the city can't control it, then the city shuts it down.
All these different practices to keep Black folks from defiling white spaces, to keep them on the outskirts.
When you were growing up in the hood, you don't really think about the negativity so much, because it was way more good times than bad.
I put the passion on the floor. You gotta be dedicated to something, whatever you do.
The music actually saved us. It saved a lot of us.
Who knows what would have happened if none of us started dancing. If it saved your life, like it always has to be that outlet, because that's like the reason that we're still here.
I really slept, eat, and Shit, footwork every day.
Yet we go back into our trauma lives right after.
Are you the good person that's destined to be a part of this culture that needs to go to Chicago and like stop somebody from killing themselves?
Shout out to my videographers. I think that they're the best at what they do. So Chicago Footwork is this culture. Here's a brief history lesson of Chicago Footwork for those of you unfamiliar, but it's a cultural formation birthed from oppressive structures and practices that have routinely harmed and disadvantaged Black youth in Chicago. It's an urban street dance that's characterized by multiple combinations of fast-paced, improvised movements of the feet, while hand and arm gestures complement the gravity-defying contortions of the footworking body, such as Paulzetti's here. Chicago Footwork is performed to footwork tracks, or these unpredictable patterns of kick drums and claps and bass lines offset by hip-hop, R&B, and now Black gospel samples. The tempo of footwork music is now played at a distinctive 160 beats per minute. Next slide. One of the most distinctive elements of Chicago Footwork is the circle. The circle is where battles take place, which are these intense rounds or matchups, right, between rival groups and individuals. Although Chicago Footwork is now a global phenomenon, it came from the south and west sides of Chicago, mostly in underserved Black communities, right? Next slide. And if we're talking about the late 80s and 90s, it was cultivated in project housing structures such as the Ida B. Wells, right, the Robert Taylor, Stateway, Cabrini Green. The projects were where the ghetto house sound and culture was birthed. Most folks have heard of house music, but not everybody is familiar with ghetto house. To understand the evolution of the art form, though, it's important to like go back and to study its cultural antecedents, right? What came before it. So footwork as a subgenre evolved from Chicago's house music scene in the 80s, was dominated by queer, Black, and Latino youth following the forced departure of disco in places like the Warehouse and the Music Box. From there, it morphed into ghetto house in the late 80s and 90s, which still had the 4-on-the-floor format that you hear in house, but kind of consisted of these sort of sped up house tracks with overlaying chants that reflected the everyday realities of living in the projects. From there, it morphed into juke music, which was also a culture as well that spanned the 90s and overlapped with the era of footwork tracks. Now, juke tracks are really secular chants over consistent loops of predictable claps, also on the 2 and on the 4. Then we finally arrived at footwork battle tracks, spanning the 90s through till now. This is when the music sped up, right? Footwork battle tracks are again defined by 160 BPMs, syncopation, unpredictable patterns, tension, and this heavy, dark, rumbling bass. A good track, I think, that is representative of like what a footwork track sounds like with that syncopation and that rumbling bass is DJ Rashad's Reverb. I usually play it, but time didn't permit. Next slide, please. Here's how I'm periodizing Chicago footwork culture, right? We can argue, in the footwork community, we'll argue about this, right, for hours, but I did this in communication with Crossfire and RP Boo and others whom I've been talking with, trying to figure out like where to end and begin each of the, the generations. And this is kind of what I came up with. Today, I'm going to talk about first generation and the transition from second generation, which is where I came into the culture, and third generation. Birthed in 1985, Chicago Footwork and I are the exact same age. So if you're doing the math, right, because you're messy, that's 25 years old. So we were both born into a city under siege by a ravaging crack epidemic and Reagan's subsequent war on Black and brown communities. This war left the longest trails of devastation in densely populated Black cities like Chicago. The number of Black males sent to prison for drug-related crimes between 85 and 2005 rose 2,000% from like 400 to 8,000. And this exponential increase was directly tethered to the war on drug under Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and I would argue under Obama as well. It was hella policies that basically systematically funneled Black and brown men and women into jails and prisons through racist traffic stops, mandatory minimums for crack distribution and possession, among other dragnet policies, right? In fact, in a recent interview, I asked first generation footworker Wicked about the impact of the drug war on Black communities in Chicago, specifically in the Ida B. Wells projects where he grew up. Wicked was a kid in the 80s during the advent of the war on Black communities, but he actually bore witness to it as a teenager in the 90s, right? So he said like the projects were so oversaturated with drugs that, quote, selling drugs was a trade, end quote. Quote, we were really street pharmacists, end quote, he says. He also explained the corruption of the Chicago Police Department and how the police would plant drugs on Black youth, many of whom are just getting their records expunged, right? And so slide, please. Go ahead and play that clip. No audio, Mark.
This was dirty. At the time, in the 90s, a lot of the police were dirty. Like, if you go back, a lot of guys just got their records expunged because they had bogus charges on them. They was all over the news about like a year or two ago. A lot of brothers from the low end were dirty cops that was setting up planned work on them, gave a lot of dudes like bogus felony records. We would be out, I mean, we was all serving. You know, it was a way of life at that time. Unfortunately, we was all hustling, and they would pull up on you, and if they didn't find nothing on you, they'll have to work in the car, and they'll put it on you.
So the crack epidemic and, you know, the subsequent tough on crime policies led to the breakdown of, I would say, like the nuclear Black family, right, or the Black community, and the destruction of many, you know, Black families. And it was a huge influence on the dance group culture that formed in Chicago in the mid 80s, right? So first generation footworkers, so I'm talking about like those who pioneered the culture from like 85 to 97, you know, they've relayed stories to me about finding their way to the Chicago dance culture in search of surrogate families, because theirs were victim of both epidemics, crack and mass incarceration. In their 2018 interviews, the presidents of the first two Southside dance groups, Darnell Payne and Ronnie Sloan, recalled having to serve as big brothers and later father figures to their younger members in the 80s and 90s, because theirs were in jail or because they increasingly became targets of police when navigating their communities. House Arrest 2 President Juan Frazier said in a recent phone interview that in 1990, when his group formed as youngsters, he and his members joked about how there was, quote, only one dad on our block, and so we call him neighborhood dad, end quote. But Juan said it really wasn't until they were older that they realized that their fathers were incarcerated. Although he only discussed the influence of house music on their chosen name during his phone call interview, it's safe to assume that for me, House Arrest 2 as a group name also reflects the sort of burgeoning racist carceral state of the nation and city, which influenced the cultural lexicons, or like the system of language, right, of Black youth in the hood. So you really got to take into consideration the crack epidemic and the growing prison industrial complex to understand the first generation of Chicago footwork, right? But certainly crack would nestle in the bosom of a city already plagued by decades of systematic segregation, with Black crime and carnage concentrated on the south and west sides of the city, and white wealth and opportunity siloed primarily in its northern and its suburban quarters, right? I was the product of a middle-class Southside neighborhood, but my community wasn't immune to the violence or gang life. But it really wasn't until I started doing this work on Chicago footwork that I began to sort of understand why, right? Why was I seeing like a lot of the stuff that I was seeing? But by 2000, when I was coming of age, Mayor Richard M. Daley and the Chicago Housing Authority launched a plan for transformation, which Tiff talked about. It was basically disguised as like this initiative to improve the lives and the living conditions of like the public housing residents at the time. You know, none of the units had passed viability tests, right? But really, they just wanted to privatize housing, gentrify the neighborhoods to produce more white wealth. And to do that, you got to get rid of the bad elements, right? And so they called it the most ambitious public housing makeover in history. Slide, please. Northwestern historian D. Bradford Hunt, with whom I actually just recently spoke, said in his book, The Blueprint for Disaster, that the CHA had devised this plan to demolish, quote, 18,500 of the Chicago Housing Authority's existing 29,000 family apartments, right? 18,000 of 29, and then renovate almost 6,000 others, right? And then integrate its former residents into 25,000 revitalized and mixed income homes, right? They gave tenants basically Section 8 housing vouchers as they awaited rebuilds or renovations. According to Hunt, you know, the plan dispersed residents, and you can do the math yourself, right? He says only a portion of the new dwellings were dedicated to former public housing families, right? So we also interviewed UIC professor Dr. David Stovall, who explained this disaster. But in the interest of time, we're gonna go past that slide.
1999.
Yeah. But here are the facts, right? So the outcome of the plan was dismal. There were significantly fewer replacement units, crazy lease compliant rules that prevented families from returning to the dwellings, like, you know, you couldn't have felonies, right? And we just talked about the mass incarceration era. And it was a disastrous relocation agenda that really just deposited many former public housing residents into more poverty-stricken communities, while others were able to sort of voucher into mixed income and some middle-class communities like mine. The neighborhoods of the people were forced to relocate to, those neighborhoods were still under-resourced and hyper-segregated, so the violent outcome makes sense. You had dissipated gangs relocated into neighborhoods of rival gangs. One study said that the crime rate in communities invaded by public housing residents increased 21% during this time, right? So what was the impact of the plan for transformation on the dance community? One thing I've been wrestling with was the loss of cultural history that the structures housed. I've spoken to DJ Clint and others about the projects, about how they were, basically where you wanted to be if you wanted to be a part of the ghetto house culture, and the parties. And I recall Stovall saying in his interview, quote, "But while you're having parties, buildings are coming down," end quote. So it's not just a loss of like infrastructure and mere matter, it's an immaterial dispossession that we have to still account for. As a dancer himself, a former public housing resident, and a cultural historian in his own right, Christopher Mad Dog Thomas has commented extensively on the loss of cultural history. One thing he comments on is how the biggest back-to-school parade in the nation, Chicago's Bud Billiken Parade, evokes his history. Quote, "The shorties are dancing right past gentrified spaces where their mothers and grandmothers used to live before they were forced to migrate to different parts of the city." Slide, please. They doing parade marches past the open field and the Marianos where the wells used to stand. The dances they doing and the music was birthed in those spaces, but this is history we don't even acknowledge. The kids today don't even know this, end quote, right? And so part of, again, what I want to do with this residency is sort of create some consciousness about some of these historical practices, right, which still affect some of them today and help them to understand why. So let's talk more about this breach, though. The displacement and dispersal of former public housing residents into more segregated communities meant the closing of social spaces attached to or associated with, the project units, right? So the Boys and Girls Clubs, etc. Many of these spaces were practice spaces and hubs where dance groups gathered. One of the earlier groups, Phase 2, practiced in the wells where Wicked resided. This is what Wicked said during a phone interview, quote, "We practiced at the community center in Madden Park, right in the middle of the wells. When the wells came down about 02, Phase 2 was on a decline. Many didn't want to move to opposition neighborhoods, so moved out of town. This," and he meant the dispersal, "helped with the dismantling of Phase 2 by like 05, right? And then remember from that slide that third generation starts at about 2005, right? And so the Robert Taylors, the Ida B. Wells, the Rockwell Gardens, much of Cabrini Green, Stateway Gardens, and several other high rises and low rises were demolished by 05. And this is actually really important to understand in the third generation, that shift from second to third, right? Which was the era of dismantled dance groups, the rise of battle clips, hyper-aggressive energy, and more spontaneous street battles. The plan for transformation also made footwork youth culture more susceptible to violence, but according to Stovall, the plan was assisted by the Chicago's gang loitering ordinance, which was declared unconstitutional in '99, at the same time that the plan for transformation was gearing up to wreak its own havoc. Stovall argues almost a decade of rounding up gang leaders until '99 produced loose affiliations, a dried up drug trade, and consequently more violence. So Stovall states, quote, "A splintering of traditional gang cultures in Chicago has upped the tension at a level we haven't seen for some time," end quote. So the plan occurred on the heels of a decade, right? So almost a decade, it started in '92, of rounding up gang chiefs and the loss of governing structures and allegiances, right? Wicked told us that even if you came from a building that was GD or gangster disciple and moved to a GD neighborhood in the city, you were still a target. With the leaders locked away, the gang affiliations were now determined more regionally from block to block, right? We from 64th, we now from 63rd. Wicked then shared the hesitancy of public housing residents to relocate since the plan for transformation deposited gangs into these rival communities. Clip, please.
With the gang variations, it was a lot of GDs. A whole lot. Shit, I was one. Phase 2 was primarily that type of group, really known for that because of the Ida B. Wells. Even if you wasn't one, you was guilty by association. And the low end is like huge, man. So it's like you could frequent the whole neighborhood and be around thousands, that was all up under the same gang affiliation. So when they tore it down, a lot of people, It was like home base. You know that you can come to. You could go to the Ickies. You could go to the Wells, which the Wells was big as hell. And then you got the Robert Taylors. Even though they had different buildings, that was different gangs. But and you even had Stateway. You was around a large number of the same gang that you was from. So it's like when they tore the buildings down, and you had to move. Like you, no, a lot of people didn't want to move to certain opposition neighborhoods, you know, because you was just accustomed and used to it. You talking about over 20 plus years of being in the same neighborhood around the same gang, the same affiliation, you know. So wasn't nobody trying to move to Terrortown on 75th over East. No shade though, no disrespect, but that's the 90s. You know, you wasn't trying to move around, moving Parkway around the BDs. Not that we ain't had nothing against them, but it's like, you know, that was the thing about the projects. It isolated everything. So when they tore them down, and I mean like all of them, it like spreaded everybody out. You know, so a lot of people did move out of town.
What's interesting is that, like, you know, people moved out of town to avoid having to move into these neighborhoods, right? So that seems like just so much to have to contend with, right? And it made me think about like why and how there became a footwork community in St. Louis or in cities like, you know, like cities in Iowa and you know, in Minnesota. And it's because these were cities that allowed or that accepted those housing vouchers that, you know, folks were given during this particular time once they you know, destroyed the projects, right? But when Wicked was forced out of the Wells on the low end in Chicago in 2004 and given a Section 8 voucher, he relocated into a neighborhood populated by Black P-Stones. But he told me during the mayhem of the plan, like right before he was forced to like voucher out, right, out of the Wells, he himself encountered basically what was a foreshadow for this rise in tension. Mark, we're gonna skip that slide though, but in that slide, he basically talks about, you know, being in and having his life threatened, right, because of, you know, his low-end affiliations, okay? In Stovall's work, he calls this engineering conflict. In other words, all these, not that slide yet, please. And in other words, all these policy transformations, right? The plan for transformation, the gang loitering ordinance, and later the systematic closing of 50 public schools and sending these kids into schools of rival gangs. All of this manufactured the tensions among Black youth, which also just really justified over policing in these communities, right? So let's extrapolate for a minute, right? You got the dismantling of dance groups given the loss of practice spaces, the dispersal of youth in new crime-ridden communities, both in the rim suburbs and throughout the city. And think about it, they pissed, like they lost their homes, they full of angst and frustration, right? They in search for new social affinities, new dance outlets, and given that the DJs have sped the music up to 160 around 98, all of these factors taken together, Chicago Footwork became an almost exclusive battle culture, ushering in the third generation. All right, play the clip, please. Battle cliques, they didn't need formal spaces of which, you know, groups like Phase 2 were dispossessed, right, for a long time, or at least until folks like Letitia Waters, Maurice Folsom, Walla Camp made sure footworkers had a space to battle in. You know, footworkers really just practice in the middle of public streets and alleys and garages and basements, right? So to really understand the second to third generation transition, the plan for transformation was a key ingredient in this sort of raw, uncut, unscripted, aggressive battle tradition that's solidified in the third, right? So we also got to think about Chicago Footwork's relationship to the broader sort of history of racial segregation, right? So Footwork as a response to the ways that the city developers, or was a response to the ways like that, you know, that the Chicago Housing Authority, the Daily Machine, right, effectively concentrated Black folks in segregated areas of the city, depriving them of resources, sustainable living, mobility, right, since the early 20th century. Many footworkers across generations have shared with me their awareness of the fact that wealth is funneled into predominantly white spaces like the gentrified Loop, downtown, while vacant lots, liquor stores, fried chicken chains, shout out to Harold's, continue to litter the disinvested South and West sides. Consequently, these agents of power have effectively, you know, curtailed the movements of Black folks in the spaces they allowed to inhabit. Like they don't want them in those spaces, right? So, you know, Westside Footworker Steps discuss making the best out of his limited radius of his Austin community. Clip, please.
In this area, it was like, it was so secluded for me. Like I only knew this area. You got my elementary school straight down here. So it's like elementary school here, and my high school straight down here. It's just Austin High School. So it's like both of these community schools. So it's like from leaving from here, walk there, and then to drop my sisters off at school and walk down here to this way. So it's like I had no choice but to be like, I gotta make this my domain, and like I'm very known.
Steps also told me that because he was geographically contained, he had to think outside of the box. This when he turned to pom-pom, flipping, and footwork as cultural modes of escape. Also, footworker / DJ Sir Timo confirmed how footworkers' bodies have this sort of physiological, this kinesthetic response to confined spatial configurations of Chicago. Clip, please.
I noticed that the way that our houses are shaped in our community, the space within the houses, the fact that all of the houses are bunched up, that's prison. When you look at the project buildings, when you look at the row houses, it's house on house on house on house on house. This is all one cage. And you have all of these different mentalities basically locked in this cage, fighting for survival, fighting to find some type of place to get out. We boxed in the hood, it's closed in. That's the intimate part. It's very intense. All of the energy is focused right in here. It's like the eye of the storm, like a tornado. We doing all this. The whole round.
For Timo, the battle circle is where we release the tensions of our imprisoned bodies. Clip, please. The construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway under Mayor Richard J. Daley began in the 60s and basically enclosed Black residents among the State Street corridor. So on what you see on the right there, widening the chasm that separated white and Black communities on the South Side in the mid 20th century, right? And in an interview, the low-end legend DJ Clint recounted having grown up 30 years later in the 90s in Chicago public housing projects located on the low end, basically not too far from the Dan Ryan, which still separated Black families from white families. So Clint grew up, following its construction 30 years later in an era of racially charged attacks on Black youth who transgressed, I think that's Wentworth, right? The Wentworth Street dividing line. On the other side was the predominantly white Bridgeport community, which housed then it was called Comiskey Park Stadium, where the White Sox play, and home of, Mayor Daley on that side. And Clint lived within Chicago's Black Belt, known for concentrated poverty, snipers on tops of roofs, gang culture. Although Clint was fortunate to travel beyond these conditions, he says that some of his peers were not. Clip, please.
So like Dion them used to come out with these tapes called Sox Park Mob, and they were the rap mixes. They played all hip hop, right? But Sox Park is Comiskey Park in that time, before it became guaranteed rate and all of that. It was called Comiskey Park, and that was symbolized the low end. You know what I'm saying? So like, it was one point in time that we couldn't go to Bridgeport. And it's documented murders where they killed kids that went over there, Black kids that went over there. So all this music was made like we were our own entertainment. We couldn't go nowhere. Like it was boundaries set up, invisible boundaries set up in the city of Chicago. The red line is a boundary / Dan Ryan Expressway. That's a boundary. All of the freight trains that's going around these certain neighborhoods are boundaries. Now everything is kind of blurred, but back then you couldn't go in these certain neighborhoods because you would get beat up or possibly killed. You know what I'm saying? It was rough. So with all of that, you know what Black people do with struggle? We invent some shit. We create. We do something that's gonna give us some enjoyment, some fun. And it's so crazy because like a lot of these people didn't shop nowhere outside of the low end. We didn't go nowhere. Well, I did. I was blessed because my mom, we went everywhere. But a lot of my friends never even been downtown in the 90s.
So I want to say a little bit more about like how we've relied on this culture and art form to resist, right? How we've created our own sort of underground cultural space of belonging where we can exist and thrive, right? So footwork music has offered our imprisoned bodies of freedom and a mobility. Clip, please. In his 21 interview, Portland footwork and music historian Goldrat stated, quote, "The tension comes from the syncopation and the crazy patterns of the offbeat and the persistent bass energy. The patterns don't make sense at first. The rumbling bass gives a broad playing field to dance and by extension, a freedom of mobility, a freedom to play with, instead of being limited by and he meant the consistent claps that we hear in Juke," right? So Goldrat's coupling, I heard when I listened to him say that, I'm thinking of, open geography and freedom and mobility. All of this for me sort of just reverberates the restricted mobility of the footworking youth, who are the unfortunate inheritors of a long history of residential segregation in Chicago. So these unpredictable sonic elements that are kind of abrasive when you first listen to the tracks, right? They allow footworkers whose bodies are otherwise physically confined a place to travel freely, right? Even if that's only sort of a metaphysical kind of travel, right? And we've relied on Chicago footwork as a whole culture to carve out this underground world where we could illuminate our humanities, render ourselves legible to one another. And I want to refer you here to Ohio State scholar Caretha Mitchell's concept of homemaking. She says that's like carving out these sort of regenerative spaces of possibility, right? For Mitchell, she says that Black people have to cultivate what she calls homemade citizenship. That's a deep sense of success and belonging, she says, that does not depend on civic inclusion and mainstream recognition. I argue that homemaking basically enables us to escape our captive realities, all the engineered conflicts, all the portrayals of Black youth as monsters and animals depicted in the local and national medias, right? Because of the structures of unbelonging, Black youth in Chicago descend into our own underground regions. And during interviews, a lot of have told me that, like, a new world of possibilities opened up for them. So in the earlier DJ Clint clip, remember he said, what Black folks do in struggle, we create some shit. So for me, Clint is alluding to homemaking, to harnessing ghetto house culture to transform his realities. We're gonna skip that clip and then go to the picture, Clint, please. So Clint, he relied on his Boss, let me get this right, 600 drum machine and his Roland JS30 sampler, and he made a name for himself, right? So I would say he was literally the rose that grew from the concrete, because in his interviews, he talks about like how he would use the cinder blocks of, the walls of the project to change the claps and the bass and the music, right? And in doing so, he revolutionized ghetto house music and culture, right? In the late 90s, and, made a name for himself. That's homemaking to me. So in our underground world of Chicago footwork, we are the developers, the architects, the realtors, the storytellers. In our sacred underground homes, we speak a common language of the body, right? We see Chicago footwork to give voice to our individual and collective experiences when normative modes of expression aren't available to us. Clip, please. So I've identified, and the longer version of this presentation, right, 3 different ways that footwork has become an embodied language of resistance. And I only have time for one, right? So I'm gonna skip. So if you want to hear more about like the police car thing, I'll go back to that. But during his interview, and so this is number 2, how footwork as a language can be seen through challenge and state violence, right? So Mad Dog sort of raved about having to breathe environmental toxins from the nearby landfills where he grew up in the Allgill Gardens housing projects, right? And Stovall's told us that in his interview, the EPA declared the land on which the garden sits as having the highest concentration of toxicity in the country, right? So the Natural Resource Defense Council basically said that the community had the highest rates of cancer, along with scary rates of other illnesses, right, which related to the exposure of these toxic substances, right? And so in the 90s, the EPA located elevated levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pesticides, heavy metals in the soil, right? A bunch of bad stuff. But breathing and consuming these toxins resulted in Mad Dog's chronic asthma and exacerbated his mother's, slide please, heart conditions, resulting in her death. Next slide. So Mad Dog's recourse was, to harness Chicago footwork as a language to critique environmental racism. 2 years later, he won this, or 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, he won this prestigious grant for which he used to choreograph this film titled Footwork Through the Trauma. And the piece basically that he performed live a few times is called Shortness of Breath. And it begins with a footwork routine, and then it ends with a poem that examines basically growing up in the gardens, right? And the many generations of family members who perished from cancer and mostly respiratory, health issues like COPD, asthma, congestive heart failure. He talks about how Big Pharma made a killing on prednisone and albuterol. And this is, him and his family, like they were disabled and then killed while he was debilitated, I argue, for profit. Then he intentionally, in the performance, he recites the poem following the full performance, basically to reify, like, having had to navigate his community in footwork, always out of breath. Here's one rendition of it that we did at a show that we did this past summer in Dayton, Ohio. Slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry.
Footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma. But I can't breathe, just like my mama. Footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma. But I can't breathe, just like my mama. My mother told me I'll always be shortened of breath. She said, baby, I'm sorry, but at times you cannot breathe. All because you was born in a polluted all-gill garden where waste management showed total disregard for Black life. Right across the street from our garden, our city burns as garbage and waste, and that pollution runs through our water pipes into our Kool-Aid jar. When you ride past 131st Street on the Bishop Ford, you can smell the stench of cancerous, asthmatic, Black death. Every person in my family shared this fate. Imagine being born into a family where nobody can breathe. In 1991, my mama lived with an in-law charge in one lung. And for 11 years, she had to be on 24-hour oxygen until she passed away from COPD in 2018. I know and I recognize that I'm going to someday share that same fate. But until then, I'm gonna footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma. But I can't breathe, just like my mama. Footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma. But I can't breathe, just like my mama.
So, Mad Dog here is critiquing, he's using the language of Chicago footwork, right? This embodied language of resistance to call out environmental injustices, rather than, doing so primarily through formal channels of verbal language, right? And so next, I don't even know if I have a next slide, but during this year-long residency, I do. This is the kind of art activism that you can expect from me, or more so from the dancers, because I don't really dance anymore. This is kind of the work that I do now. And the team that I assemble, right? And so the project is called Place, Space, and Works. And basically it's a 3-phase project we're looking at, and this is all tentative, right? So none of this is set in stone, but, we want to bring in, youth and community leaders, scholars and activists, right? And it's going to culminate in a showcase by the end of summer, early fall, or a big production that uses footwork to tackle topics like, land sale contracts, or the plan for transformation, no-knock warrants, environmental racism, and public housing. All right, and that's it. I will entertain questions.
All right, we have some questions populating in the chat. Please continue to drop your questions in the chat. as well as raise your Zoom hand if you can. If you're not sure how to do so, there should be at the bottom of your screen a bar with a bunch of icons, and one says reactions. If you click that reactions, it's a smiley face, and then there's a raised hand. Should be the first thing you see. So if you have a question you'd like to come off mute, otherwise you can put it in the chat. I'm going to start with the question that came up earlier. I'm just going to share it and read it as it was shared in the chat. I have a question. As both a queer man and a museum professional, how can museums open a dialogue with communities they have previously ignored, shunned, or even neglected? What are the benefits of this cooperation? And I'll put that in the chat too for folks. And while maybe ShaDawn is considering that question, can we also just give it up for ShaDawn and give more Zoom snaps and claps? That presentation, I don't know if you got a chance to keep your eye on the chat, but there was a lot of love. So we're gonna make sure to share it so you can see all of it, ShaDawn, because there was a lot of love and also resonance and, you know, people really identifying with what you're saying and adding to this history. So this is just the launch, just the beginning of our collaboration together. I know this work has been ongoing for a long time, not only for you, but a lot of the people who you've been working with who are here tonight. So we're just excited to be a part of it, to be a moment, to be a milestone and contributing, but it's an ongoing conversation. The chat is very much demonstrating that. And so, yeah, thanks everybody for the love and participation. It's been a really great night. We're gonna keep talking, but I'm gonna drop this question one more time. So just thinking about museums and communities, you know, what is the sort of role of cultural institutions and museums, especially those that haven't been maybe as connected, that want to get connected?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So immediately I thought about, you know, the museum, and I want to say it was Paris that put Saartjie Baartman's, you know, the South African woman who was paraded around as a freak exhibit, right? Because of her sort of racial anatomical differences, right? And so after she died, they dismembered her and put her, you know, body parts on display so that she became a public spectacle. And it's a museum that did this, right? And so I think you're right about museums, you know, doing more damage and perpetuating, you know, just dehumanizing narratives about Black people. But what's cool about the National Public Housing Museum is that it is a cultural institution, and it is centering, right, the voices of marginalized people, right? And so I'll give you a quick example. So before I go there, though, another reason I was interested in the National Public Housing Museum is because, like, I wanted access to, you know, former public housing residents and its archives, its oral histories, right? I was given a keynote one day, or in 21 at the University of Dayton at this symposium on redlining. And given my, you know, my presentation, I'm actually, the book is right here, but you know, I'm quoting from this book, The Color of Law, right? And at the end, right, I'm in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. At the end, a woman stands up, Mrs. Henrietta, I learned that was her name, and she says, "That ain't how I remembered it. I'm a 17-year Cabrini Green resident," right? And so, you know, who am I going to listen to? The person with the experiential knowledge who actually lived, right? You know, that history, or someone who's sort of producing academic, you know, kind of sort of historical knowledge production, right? And so it just reminded me that, like, I can't approach this work with, you know, a theoretical agenda or some type of, you know, academic agenda, right? I have to be connected to the people who actually lived these realities, right? And so this particular museum is privileging those voices, and that's why this residency was great for me.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that too. I also just dropped a link and I saw some of this in the chat. If you're interested in sharing your story, either as part of this project or your connection to footwork and public housing, we want to invite y'all to get involved. We have some forms that we can drop in the chat. We can also stay in touch. We have y'all's information to follow up, just to make sure that folks get a chance to share their story and add it to the narrative and the history. So another question, we don't have too much more time, but we're going to keep track of these questions. And again, this is the beginning, so this is an ongoing dialogue. I'll encourage y'all to keep dropping your questions, and we'll keep integrating them into the work that we're doing. But I think this one is very interesting. So I'm just going to highlight it and I drop it in the chat and also read it out loud. It says, footwork seems to be male dominated. How have women and other gender people made a place for themselves in this dance genre?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that always comes up. And, footwork is a very male dominated space, right? And so in the book project, this is something that I'm going to cover. But like so much so that like it's the ethos, the energy, the ideals of it, right, are masculine. But so is Chicago, right? Like one of the things I argue is that Chicago masculinizes Black women, right? In order to survive, you sort of have to sort of table any kind of feminine energy, right, to survive in that city. And so footwork is just a microcosm of Chicago. And so if you want to be at the top in the footwork circle, you have to sort of adopt many of those sort of masculinized personas, and compete if you want to compete with the guys, right? There was the king of the circle, initially before there was a queen of the circle, right? So that's one thing that I would argue. But like before I even came into the circle, like a lot of first generation or I would say like late first generation, like late 90s women, they were dancing in heels, right? Like doing parade marches, like banging in heels. But like when I came on the scene, like a lot of me and my crew, we wanted to battle the dudes, right? And so we started learning from the guys because we felt like that's what was going to get us that visibility. So some of what I've been doing, like and working on this project is trying to find ways to, make it more gender expansive, right? So there is a queer community in Chicago footwork culture, but also just allowing people to enter into the circle and perform, whatever, gender identity like feels normal and natural for them. But I will say when you get in that circle, you have to still battle in like a sort of really aggressive way in order to like sort of be taken seriously. So it is something, I think that's a really complex question. And I'm not sure if someone in the chat might want to chime in about like the gender politics of Chicago footwork, but that is something that I'm tackling in the written work that I'm doing.
That's great. And while you mentioned politics, someone else sent me a private message, but I'm gonna just say it out loud. I hope this is okay. And so because I think others may be wondering, and I do think this is also a great place to maybe wrap us up, which is, are there any plans to get this documentary, this presentation, or this work in front of political leaders in office today, if it hasn't been already?
Yeah, no, it is. I've got, a few connections with, some policy, some change agents in the city. But like one of the topics, I want to explore is no-knock warrants. So like the violation, like not just taking people's homes, but violating their homes, right? So I think the quintessential example of that in Chicago would be what happened to Fred Hampton, but also what happened to Anjanette Young in 2019, I think, right? And so just, I want to think through, use footwork to create more dialogue about no-knock warrants and right, and how, we're really just like revisiting the, slave patrols and the violation of Black bodies, the invasion of Black spaces and the violation of Black bodies, and, why the Anjanette Young ordinance should have been passed. And so, yes, I do want to think about how we can use footwork as a language to, create more transformative societies for, Black and brown people in the city.
Yes.
I don't know if Anjanette is on here, but yeah, we want to work with you.
Yes, she is. It seems like she is. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, that's a big part of this project, right? Is activating and working with communities, but also speaking truth to those in power and making sure that political leaders and people who find themselves in positions of power understand these things and can apply them to their platforms and can respond to what the communities are saying and showing through these kinds of.
So yes, ShaDawn, I'm here.
Oh, there she goes.
I've been here the whole time, and I am all on board with working with you guys on this project.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming off mute. Appreciate you. I'm glad to see you in the room. And yeah, so many others that we are aspiring to work with, and that ShaDawn is already looped in with the museum. And we're excited to bring all these folks together in the next, year through workshops, through community engagement, and ultimately through a showcase and performance that the general public and political leaders and folks who are doing organizing around these issues will be invited to collaborate, contribute, and to witness. So that's the end of our time. Unfortunately, I think we could go at least 20 to 30 more minutes just with all the conversations that we're just getting started with. But again, this is really just the launch. It's just the beginning. So thank you again, ShaDawn, for your amazing presentation and all of the work that you've done up until now, and also for committing to work with the museum in this way. We're all just really, really excited to be able to embark on this collaboration. Just for folks who are wondering how to stay connected, our social media channels with the museum and also with Footwork Saved My Life, which is ShaDawn's preferred handle for both Instagram and Facebook. So if you want to add us there, we'd love to stay in touch, and we'll be sharing out different updates and presentations as they come. We also have our newsletter and our mailing list from the National Public Housing Museum that we will continue to share things out. And then at the next slide, I believe we also mentioned this, but we have the oral history archive. Particularly for this project, we want to continue to collect oral histories that talk about this connection between the history of footwork and public housing and some of these other social issues related to the public housing. Is there anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, no, it is like, so a lot of people joined today, and it's a lot of other stories, right, that like I have not included yet, partly because of time's sake, but like I want to sit down and create a more comprehensive narrative about Chicago footwork and housing. And so reach out to me, on those preferred handles, or if you got my personal number, like you can do that as well. Because I really want to know these narratives, right? And like everybody's story matters, but it's kind of like hard to piece a few together, right? And so I want like to tell a more comprehensive story on both sides of town, and across gender or whatever. But I do want to clarify that like a lot of the work that I'm doing is more so focused on the people in Chicago, right? That's where it came from. These are the folks like I'm not sure if Wheezy on here. These are the folks who wake up every day and they think about footwork, and footwork is the lifeblood of like this is their form of survival. And so I do privilege the narratives of Chicago, but some of my work does also speak to the globalized culture, but that's kind of not what this project is for. I do want to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and similarly, we're here in Chicago. We're about the bringing all these stories together, but we would love to make sure Chicago is well represented in all these conversations. Okay, I think we have maybe one more slide, just a reminder to folks if you want to stay in touch and join our the museum's mailing list. Again, we will be sharing out project updates in addition to following ShaDawn if you're interested in following the museum, and also stay tuned for our opening. So some of this programming and collaboration is going to coincide with the official opening of the museum on the Near West Side in 2024. So lots of amazing things happening next year. We hope to see y'all, connect some of you folks that are doing this work. Also, we talked about the music room. That's going to be part of this, and thinking about activating that. So if y'all have records, tracks, videos, whatever kind of cultural ephemera, we're also still collecting and building a database and playlists and things like that. So lots of great opportunities to collaborate and continue the conversation. Thank you again, everyone, especially ShaDawn. We appreciate y'all one more time in the chat. Just give it up as much love as you can send for this journey. We appreciate y'all and your time and taking the time out tonight. DJ Clint, we're definitely going to be in touch with you. I know you're already on the project, so everybody will definitely be hearing from us. If you're connected with ShaDawn, we're going to try to be in all in your business for the next year.
That's big bro. So we got some things in the pipeline.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you. This video will be uploaded to YouTube, so stay tuned for that, and please share it with all your folks who couldn't make it tonight, and more soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My students, I need to know that y'all were on here if you want your extra credit.